Okay, so we are quickly moving on. We are almost done with the public policy textbook, and we'll be moving on to other things beginning next class. But just to round things out, this is basically the chapter that deals with how you evaluate public policies. So, again, the objectives of this chapter are to identify the differences between market and government failures, recognize the steps in the policy analysis process, apply each step to a real world scenario. Policy analysis is client oriented advice relevant to public decisions and informed by social values. Analysis methods used here do not require economic modeling and assume understanding of the political process. Policy analysis is an ongoing process conducted throughout the policy process itself. So we've already talked about, some of the ideological notions around, market and government failures. I won't repeat all that right now. So let's just start to get through this. The policy analysis process. Step one, identify and define the problem, understand the problem source and specification, identify alternatives, policy solutions for fixing the problems, establish evaluation criteria to determine how to decide which alternative may lead to success. And then step four, select the best alternative and monitor it to ensure desired outcomes are met. Identify and define the problem. Establish what is already known and assemble evidence to officially define the problem. We've already covered this in previous classes. Problem may initially include normative statements. For example, the rich should pay their fair share in taxes. Analysts must operationalize terms. In other words, take these sort of value statements and find a way that you can actually analyze them and essentially evaluate the effectiveness of proposals to do things like this. In other words, make sure that the rich actually pay their fair share. How would you actually evaluate a policy that was seeking to do that? Delineate the issue's boundaries, how long the problem has existed, and in what context. Consider issue interconnectedness, how the problem relates to other issues. Collect data and operationalize terms based on gathered evidence. Again, for example, defining rich as making more than 1 billion per year. I would probably lower that. I don't think you'd necessarily have to be a billionaire to do that. You could probably drastically lower that. In fact, list goals and objectives, present data to affected parties to gauge satisfaction or dissatisfaction, identify the policy envelope, all data that must be considered when defining the policy, display potential costs, benefits, and layouts describing what each party gains and loses. Review the problem statement by operationalizing ambiguous terms. Again, individuals making over 250,000 are paying less in taxes than those making less than 60,000. This is a real issue. With the wealthy people paying less in taxes than people who make much less income. Identify alternatives. Alternatives are the various options an analyst can provide to the client: raising marginal tax rates, raising luxury tax, imposing greater inheritance tax. Maintaining the status quo, not changing existing policy must be considered as well. Policy alternatives are not mutually exclusive. They can be combined. Alternatives should be compared to goals and objectives, narrowed to those most likely to achieve desired outcomes. Clear and concise, alternatives avoid jargon and capture intent in a single sentence. Again, for example, raise marginal tax rates by 17% on individuals making more than 750,000 per year. Tactics for developing alternatives. Study existing scholarship and policy analysis. Surveys to gauge feasibility and audience expectations. Comparison of best practices, examining similar states, municipalities, or nonprofits. Creative brainstorming for senior analysts familiar with the problem area. So not just anyone apparently should brainstorm, but only very experienced people, according to the textbook. Establish evaluation criteria. These are the ones that they use. and would be pretty commonly used, uh, more or less in other uh, analysis of policy. Key criteria: effectiveness, how well the alternative solves the problem completely; efficiency, cost relative to benefits after government intervention. So again, once again, we're in a technical cost benefit analysis. Equity, equal outcomes among members of society. Freedom, individuals' rights to pursue goals without interference. Political feasibility, acceptability of policy by political stakeholders, legislative and executive. As we'll see, there's a lot sort of like baked into this assumption, which is not really talked about. Like if a policy is not politically feasible, like single payer healthcare, why is it not feasible? Especially if there is pretty strong popular support for it. They kind of tend to glide over that issue, obviously, which is a very important thing, which has to be unpacked more. Administrative feasibility, degree to which the policy can be successfully implemented. Again, a lot of assumptions built into that as well. And then finally, social acceptability, favorability of the policy proposal, which they argue can be gauged by polling, even though polling data can often be very volatile and inconsistent. Although some things, like there pretty much has been, seems like for a long time now, pretty strong majority of people that do favor things like single payer healthcare, even if it's a fairly slight a majority. When you look at Democratic voters, for example, I mean, that number often goes up to 70, 80, 80% of voters for the Democratic Party. In spite of that, though, the party does not come out in favor of single payer healthcare. Which, again, why, the why part of that question is often left unexplored and unexamined. Evaluate the alternatives, use an alternative matrix, which they provide an example of here, which I'll turn to in a moment, to compare alternatives side by side for each criterion. So it's simply just a case of just sort of checking off the boxes, and whatever policy checks off the most boxes, they consider to be the best one in most instances. Weight evaluation criteria as needed. Political feasibility may be weighted more during an election year, for example. So not all criteria necessarily all have the equal weight to each other, which does complicate their method here of just checking boxes, basically. Implementation analysis examines feasibility using degree of consensus, popularity of the alternative, and then the magnitude of change, how different from the status quo. Alternatives with high consensus and low magnitude of change are easier to implement. So, again, basically the policy of least resistance usually is the policy that wins out. But, there are lots of factors that can complicate that. Policies may be popular, like I said, but still may face significant resistance anyway, within the policymaking process itself, within the actual government institutions that design and implement the policy. We'll talk about that more, especially starting next class as we start to move into more specific policy area. Select the best alternative and monitor outcomes. Present preferred outcome to the client. After policy is accepted and proposed, proceed to formulation stage, implementation stage, and then monitoring or evaluation, basically. Further analysis may be needed if policy does not adequately solve the problem. Policy problems are rarely solved on the first try. Societal and political shifts require continuous monitoring to reduce the recognition gap, as they call it. Policy failure can be program failure, policy not implemented as designed; theoretical failure, program implemented as designed but does not deliver desired results. Methods to assess policy outcomes: before and after comparisons. Examine policy effects directly, for example, fatalities before and after speed limit change. Consider external factors as well. Another method is with or without comparisons. Compare a treated case to a non-treated case. For example, one state versus another. This does, of course, require similar geographic and demographic locales, so that the comparison, is grounded, I guess. Experimental models control environment completely, rarely possible outside hard sciences. So this is a big problem in all the social sciences. The real world is essentially the laboratory, but of course you can't control things as completely as you can in a real laboratory setting, and that makes analyzing and evaluating results much more difficult. Quasi experimental models control as much of the environment as possible, suited for small scale policies. Case study. Once again, going back to the Affordable Care Act, which they argue to be is a failure. So they stipulate that Obamacare had 3 goals, according to healthcare.gov: make assurance affordable, make affordable insurance available to everyone, expand the Medicaid program, and then support innovative programs. And they basically argue that it failed at least for 2 out of the 3 goals. Support innovative programs is left kind of vague, and so they don't really examine it, which they argue sort of outside the scope of their analysis of it. But to make insurance affordable and available, they argue is a failure, and they cite almost 30 million people still uninsured as recent as 2017. 45% of those people report cost as the main reason why they were not able to get insurance. So the Affordable Care Act did not make healthcare affordable. I mean, that of course is a pretty massive failure. It's helped the profits of health insurance companies, but it hasn't necessarily made healthcare affordable for people. And of course, even people that have health insurance, large numbers of them would also report high costs, and it's still is a very big strain on their budget as well. Expand the Medicaid program, they also regard as a failure, even though it did succeed in many states. There are, of course, they cite 14. I think since then it's changed about 10 states that have not expanded Medicaid. So that's I guess you could say a partial success at least. So what are the alternatives then? So according to the RAND Corporation, there are basically 4 real alternatives you can consider here. Maintain the ACA with no changes, just the status quo. Repeal the ACA with no replacement at all. Repeal ACA with single payer, for example, Medicare for all, or replace with another option. And so they're now going to go through each of these alternatives and again evaluate them according to the criteria that they used before, which is again included here. So they qualify to some extent. They say efficiency is excluded, which they argue would require deeper analysis beyond the case study scope. Effectiveness is measured by number of people expected to be covered. Obviously, the most effective then would be 100% of people covered. Equity is measured by the expected cost and benefit for each individual, which is a simplified approach. Freedom, measured by ability to choose your own insurance plan. I'm going to come back to that in a moment because I think the way they define it, could be worked upon a little bit. For example, how about freedom to visit whatever healthcare professional that you want to, and not be, sort of, narrowed or limited by what your insurance provider, allows you to go see, basically, people within your network. They don't discuss that aspect of it, and I think it will crop up in a very important way when they get to actually considering the different alternatives here. Then you have, again, political feasibility, which has a lot built into it, which they kind of don't really examine. The likelihood policy can be passed by Congress and signed into law. Again, why is one policy more likely than another? They don't really ever examine that. Social acceptability, measured by public polling, outright repeal, basically just relying on polling data. So going through these 4 different alternatives. Maintaining the ACA with no changes, basically keeping the status quo as it is. So effectiveness, again, you're still leaving almost 30 million people without health insurance. Equity, everyone has access to coverage, but some remain unable to afford it, which to me seems like somewhat of a contradictory statement. They have access to coverage, but they can't afford it. Well, if you can't afford it, then you don't really have access to coverage. Okay. Freedom, individuals choose their provider and plan, but mandate to have coverage limits individual freedom. Again, they don't also examine, to what extent health insurance providers limit, the freedom of their clients to again um, to use different healthcare providers. Political feasibility policy is already in place. Administrative feasibility policy is currently implemented and administered. Administrative costs unchanged. Obviously, if new policy is reached, so that obviously plays, in favor of the status quo. Obviously, you don't have to consider how feasible it is when it's already the existing policy, of course. Social acceptability, just a bare majority approve. And if you look at more recent polls, um, well, it's I think roughly about the same. Alternative two, repeal the ACA with no replacement. Um, so this doesn't seem like to be a good option at all. Number of uninsured would likely return to pre-2010 levels, less effective than the ACA, which means millions of more people, tens of millions of people more without health insurance. I think they estimate around 45 million did not have insurance prior to the ACA. Equity, everyone has access, but fewer people will be able to afford it. Again, I'm somewhat confused by that statement. If they can't afford it, then you don't really have access to it, unless I'm misunderstanding something about that. Individuals are free to decide on coverage as well if they want coverage at all. But again, not free to actually see a doctor if you don't have health insurance. It'll just be too cost prohibitive for many people. Political feasibility unlikely to pass, considering overall favorability of individual provisions within the law. So they don't think that the repeal of the ACA is likely. Of course, it hasn't happened as of yet. Administrative feasibility, feasible. The rollback could occur administratively, meaning even without an act of Congress, parts of the law could be struck down by the Supreme Court, for example, or even tinkering within the executive branch of government. Social acceptability, 52%, according to this, want the Supreme Court to overturn the ACA, even though 56% of respondents worry that they or someone in their family will lose coverage. So once again, as is often the case, public opinion seems to be kind of all over the place. I mean, people don't really know what's going on. And about the same percentage of people want the Supreme Court to overturn the ACA as the number of people that support the ACA, 51% versus 52%, which is virtually identical. Alternative three, repeal the ACA with single payer Medicare for all. Effectiveness, everyone is covered. Equity, everyone will be able to afford coverage, though higher earners will be taxed more. So some people will be taxed at a higher rate, or taxed more basically than other people, lower income people. Here's where it gets a little strange, though. I think there will not be any choice in provider. Well, yeah, because basically all health insurance will be provided through the government, so you don't have a choice now. But does that matter that much? I mean, do people really care that much who their health insurance provider is? I mean, are there significant differences in the kind of covers that these companies offer? I mean, not really. Not to any significant extent, though. Like, there might be minor differences, but otherwise, I think the differences between different types of health insurance or different health insurance companies are, virtually the same. Political feasibility, I mean, for a person at a similar level, obviously there are differences based on age and overall health, but for one person, the options that you're going to get through different health insurance providers, to my knowledge at least, is not significantly different based on personal experience at least. Political feasibility unlikely to pass. Again, they just kind of gloss over that. Well, why is it unlikely to pass? Administrative, I'm not disagreeing with them, but why is it unlikely to pass? Administrative feasibility would build off the current system. So in theory, it wouldn't be that hard to implement. Of course, the most expensive people to insure, generally elderly people, already get health insurance through Medicare, basically. I mean, that's the idea, to expand Medicare basically to everybody. Social acceptability. So again, roughly the same amount of people support this option as well. And then finally, repeal the ACA with other proposals, which are never really specified, would depend on specific proposal, but would likely cover fewer people based on the RAND analysis. Everyone has access, but no guarantee it would be more affordable. Everyone will be able to choose if they want coverage and which coverage they prefer. Unlikely to pass. Feasible in an administrative sense, and there's no real data on how popular a policy this would be. So this one they kind of leave alone because it's very sort of vague and undefined. So when they sort of plug this into their matrix, which I'll turn to in a moment, they find that the status quo and Medicare for all are tied. So the preferred alternative is either maintain the ACA or replace with Medicare for all. But let's turn to this for a second now. So this is the matrix that they use here. So you can see they're just, they plug in their criteria, they plug in the alternatives, and then it just basically becomes a exercise in checking boxes, as you can see here. So the ACA and single payer both have two boxes checked, which basically places them in the lead, which means that by checking the boxes that it sort of satisfies the criteria or sort of the best option given the criteria. So they both have social acceptance. Single payer is considered to be the most effective. ACA as a status quo is considered politically feasible, and the others you can see are have less. Now, you could go through the criteria here for single payer healthcare. Equity is an interesting one to consider because it would lead to more people having healthcare. I suppose you could argue it would be less equitable and that some people would pay more for it than others in terms of taxes. I certainly think you can still debate that a little bit more. But I'm going to leave that one to the side. Political feasibility, yeah, I would agree with that. But again, it's never really explained exactly why it's unfeasible. They don't check off administrative feasibility for either, even though the ACA, again, is already implemented, and they argue that single payer would be feasible based on just expanding Medicare for all, which, as I already mentioned, already covers basically the most expensive people to insure. The one I really want to push back on, and I've already kind of addressed it to some extent, is this idea of freedom. They don't give a check mark to single payer for freedom. And I think that's a bit strange, right? Because what do they mean by freedom? Well, you don't have a choice in your health insurance provider. Well, okay, but what kind of freedom do you get in exchange for that? And I would argue you get a lot more freedom, right? Because now under single payer healthcare, you would be able to essentially see any doctor that you want. Whereas anyone that actually has to deal with health insurance as it is, I'm sure has experienced this idea of not being able to visit certain doctors or providers based on the limitations of their network. Well, that would essentially go away with single payer healthcare. How many people have experienced this? How many people have experienced not being able to go to a doctor anymore because their insurance a provider changes? Many people, I'm sure, experience that, especially as many people get their health insurance through their employer, which of course was a major part of the Affordable Care Act. Um, Leaving aside the fact that, well, now that you have to depend upon your employer for health insurance, it actually gives your employer much more leverage over people. Some people are, absolutely um, terrified of leaving their job or losing their job because they would lose their health insurance. Clearly, that gives your employer much more leverage over their employees because you have to depend on them now for health insurance. But aside from that, and again, this also goes back to the freedom issue. If you get your health insurance through your employer, then you don't really have a choice of who your health insurance is or who your health insurance uh, provider is. You're basically dependent on whoever the employer chooses to provide health insurance. So you already don't really have much freedom under the current system as it is. And I wonder how many people have experienced this when your employer changes health insurance providers. This has happened to me and to other people I know. All of a sudden, a doctor or somebody else that you're seeing is no longer in the network for the new insurance that they've just switched to. And that causes like incredible complications and headaches for people. So I would really severely push back against this. I would argue that ACA with single payer or replace the ACA with single payer would significantly improve people's freedom. Yes, you wouldn't be able to choose who your health insurance provider is anymore, as if that actually matters. But you would basically be free to visit whatever doctor you wanted to, and you don't have to worry about out of network and out of network fees, and having to worry about who your employer decides to sign up for health insurance with, which sometimes changes on a yearly basis. Anyway, so by my count, I mean, single payer easily gets 3-2 here over the Affordable Care Act, so it should be the clear winner. And again, that's not even pushing back more on things like equity, which I think you could make an argue that single payer healthcare would obviously be much more um, equitable in the sense that people that can't currently afford to see a doctor literally or is dealing with massive medical debts would obviously make healthcare access and ability to get healthcare much more equal in that sense. But yes, there would be maybe higher taxes on higher income people. So I could see that argument at least to some extent. But the freedom argument I really don't follow at all. Everything else I pretty much agree with. If you're going to follow this method of just checking boxes basically to determine what the best policy is. But again, I mean, you might disagree with that, but based on my count, single payer easily wins 3-2 over the other options. So there you go. And again, starting next class, we'll be talking about this more as well as we go more into healthcare. And that's pretty much it. This pretty much wraps up the chapter. This is the last chapter in the public policy textbook that we've been using. So from here on in, we'll be going through different readings as we deal more in depth with different areas of policymaking, beginning with healthcare. But again, to sum up, policy analysis has two major components: diagnosing the problem, whether it's a market or a government failure, and two, analyzing the stage. We talked about market and government failures more last class, or in a previous class, class 3 actually. Key is to recognize and consider all alternatives, not just those that satisfy the client. Selection criteria must not unfairly advantage one alternative over another. And compose a careful memo to the client outlining the process used to select the preferred alternative. All right, so that pretty much wraps things up here. So take care.